Thank you. First of all, may I say, a big thank you to you guys on a warm day with all the great music that's going on out there, all these incredible things taking place, when it's really heating up on the gig. You come here to take part in a conversation with us. I'm very, very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. And as I said to a number of the sessions today, please accept my apologies and actually that of Mark as well, because we've got a largely Czech audience. We've got 2 native Czech speakers on the stage, and we're going to speak in English. So I'm sorry about that. We did a session earlier today where we talked about what the Czech Republic should do with 2 prominent Czech people in front of a Czech audience. We did that in English too. But this is an international event, so thank you. I'm going to involve you guys in the discussion today as well. I want you to feel like you can take part. So if stuff comes up you want to comment on or ask a question, try and get my eye. I'm going to keep looking out. Put your hand up. I'm particularly keen to involve women in the discussion because we're 4 guys. I feel so. I don't want. I really, women, you get priority for any questions asked. I promise you. Yeah, I'm totally prioritizing you guys. So let me just introduce us, the 4 of us. We're the 4 people who've been facilitating, leading discussions over the past 4 days of this fantastic Melting Pot forum. I'm Stuart Maister. I've been leading the discussion today about the world after Ukraine. And with me, I've got, actually, well, you know what? You can introduce yourselves. You guys are good. Just introduce yourself and tell us the discussion you had.
Okay. My name is Libor Vitasek. I'm the Czech entrepreneur and for more than 30 years now involved in cybernetics and all the technologies which we are developing and implementing in the world. Our day was on Wednesday. We were discussing the evolution of technologies and the impact of the new technologies on the world, on the climate change, on the war in Ukraine, on our healthcare systems, on the future food problems and other issues related to technological development.
Brilliant, thank you. Mark. No, you don't need to clap every time. You gave us claps, don't need any more claps, thank you. We want to get on and get into the beat.
So I'm Mark Mazin, and I'm a professor of Earth System Science in the United Kingdom. And I was very lucky. Kate asked me to come here and convene a whole day on how to save our planet. And so what we did was we had a number of panels and speakers that looked at different things. So we had talks on whether activism was a key thing that could help us save our planet. We looked at microplastics. We looked at climate anxiety. We looked at the role of arts in our understanding of the environmental debate. We also looked at natural history and museums and how they play a role in our cultural understanding of nature and climate change. And I think one of the really interesting things that came out of that was even though the challenges
I'm going to come to that in a minute. I just want you to introduce yourselves, then I'll ask you the question in a minute about the things that came out.
Okay.
Let's just quickly... Sorry, I wasn't clear on that. That's my fault. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Jakub Kalinski. As you can probably guess, I am Czech. I work in the Hybrid Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, and my main focus has been in the past few years disinformation, especially Russian disinformation, and the countermeasures against it. And that was also the topic of our day, which was Thursday. We had brilliant speakers from Lithuania, Finland, Sweden, and obviously from the Czech Republic. And we covered quite a few angles of this problem of disinformation, but we will talk about the content a bit later.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and give you a quick overview, a quick tour of some of the big ideas that have come out of these amazing days. And since I interrupted Mark so rudely there, let's start, Mark, let's now go into, please, just some of the big ideas, a few big ideas in a few minutes that came out of your day, and particularly anything that surprised you or was new to you.
So I think the big ideas that came out of my session were that we have 4 challenges in the 21st century that we have to deal with. And actually the 4 of us sort of represent those in many ways. 1, climate change. We all know about that. But we also have to deal with environmental degradation. We're also looking at things like cutting down of the rainforest, pollution in our rivers and our oceans. We have a huge issue about the state of our global environment. But we also have to think about global poverty. Okay? At the moment, we have 7 million children that die needlessly every year, 825 million people that go to bed feeling hungry every night, and because of the actual wars and conflicts around the world, that's going up. And we have 1 billion people that don't have access to clean, safe water. And the last one, of course, is global security, which you've been discussing today, and you've been having incredible conversations about that. But I think what came out of yesterday was this idea that we have all the solutions. We have the scientists, we have the business leaders, we have the technology. What we don't have is the policies or the politics to actually enact them. And I think this is where the frustration came, particularly in young people, which is they see all of this. They hear all of you, they hear all these solutions, and they go, well, these are very logical. Why not actually put them in? And this is why we had a session on climate anxiety, because a lot of people get very frustrated and really upset because they can see all the win-win solutions. You know, sort of like, if we actually have a more plant-based diet, that makes people healthier, that actually reduces healthcare costs, means that we have more money to spend on getting people out of poverty. You know, all these wonderful connections. So the thing that really surprised me was the actual really detailed questions that came from you lot, which actually made those sessions yesterday really dynamic, really interactive, and wow, brilliant to be here, and I'm hoping to be invited back, but not by Stuart.
Just on that, before we move on, just on that, did you, given what you just said, did you end the day positive and upbeat? I know you've written a book on how we can tackle these problems. So you perhaps you start from that perspective. But did you finish the day with what you learned, what you heard? Wow, the positive, or did you? Well, you tell me. How did you? What was your feeling at the end of the day?
So I think some of the sessions ended on a high note because I think this is really important, which is we must never give up the fight. Okay. If we see this huge challenge of climate change, global security, poverty, everything we do makes a difference. And so I think the hope and also the positiveness that came out of the audience and also all the speakers was everything we do matters. And actually every little bit we do is really key. And I think that, makes us feel like we are humans and part of a global humanity, but it also gives us that little bit of hope that our little contribution makes a difference. And I think that's what we left the session on yesterday.
Thank you. Libor, can we come to your day? Same question, the big ideas from the day, anything that surprised you?
Our session was very colorful because we were discussing the technologies, but in different areas. So first thing we have discussed is that we all are already cyborgs because the human beings are using technologies in both aspects, the biotechnologies as well as digital technologies. Our worlds are connected, and if you wish or not, sometimes the technologies around you, and of course the European Union is trying to limit the misuse of some big data issues by GDPR law. But on the other hand, all these technologies can also help to solve the issues in the world, as you mentioned, in healthcare, the vaccination technologies and other DNA or RNA change technologies can help to, let's say, minimize the diseases in underdeveloped part of the world, in Africa and in other countries. On the other hand, we can see now that the digital technologies and especially the artificial intelligence is not only helping the human beings, for example, even in the fields of assisted conception, where the computers can help the parents, the future parents, to assist to find the best genetic materials and so on. But it's also creating the autonomous drones, and now we can see in Ukraine that artificial intelligence And the picture recognition systems are helping both sides, the Ukrainian army and also the Russian army. And now we are even witnessing the war of technologies, not of the people, because the drones are attacking the drones, and all of this is driven by artificial intelligence systems. We can also see that let's say, the virtual digital world is becoming very smart, and the artificial intelligence systems are just limited by the speed of computers. And since last year, there was a launch of the first quantum-based computer, so it's very, very fast computer. We can expect that in 3 to 5 years, the biological thinking will be less intensive than digital thinking, so the artificial intelligence systems will be much wider than the biological systems, which might create some danger. And we are discussing what's the danger for the human beings in this world of technologies. And surprisingly, the people and also the audience was not scared by these technologies, as long as we keep the right to use the technologies, but not to have it as duty. Right. Because if it is a duty that, for example, you have to apply into your body some biochips or genetically adopted proteins, then it's a totalitarian habit. And it was discussion between German and Czech speaker, and Germans both and Czech, they have, let's say, experiences with totalitarian system. So the first, let's say, conclusion of this session was that we really can use the technologies as long as it is the right, not the duty. And the second issue, what is the biggest danger for the future in terms of technologies, which was a big surprise for me, it was discussed that it is the Czech educational system and the way the Czech system is financed, because we focus less on creativity, and the system of financing the school system or the educational system is in fact guiding the children and the people into a certain direction, which is not really, let's say, a freedom future. So it's really, we need to change the financing of the system, that there is more creativity and more freedom for the children to choose which way they want to be educated.
Right, thank you. By the way, I am a cyborg already, I can admit that. I have an artificial hip. So it's like a super hip. I can go really, really fast on one leg. That's the only problem. The other leg can't keep up, that's the challenge. Okay, so let's go to the third day, to Jakob. You were looking at disinformation and which is obviously flows. I mean, we just heard really that technology is like fire, isn't it? It can cook your food or it can burn you. You know, it can kill you. So, what came out of your day?
When Mark was talking about the frustration they felt throughout the day, it was unfortunately pretty same emotion during our day. But perhaps let me start with one point that could be potentially a bit more optimistic, and that might be surprising to some. And during the interview we had on social media with the Czech academic Maria Heřmanová, she was actually pointing out that the problem with social media and their role in spreading disinformation is not as huge as some people might want to think. It's definitely not the case that social media would be responsible for disinformation. Disinformation had been here decades, centuries before social media came. The one element that definitely social media are making easier is the quickness of amplification and perhaps the so-called information laundering. In the 80s, it took the Soviets several years to actually launder the disinformation that allegedly CIA created AIDS to get rid of the black population of the United States. They planted the story in India, then they had some scientists in East Germany. It took them years to actually launder the disinformation. This is a process that you can now do extremely quickly. So that's definitely one thing where the social media might be making the situation worse. But the often discussed problems with polarization or filter bubbles, there is a lot of differing research. Some research would even show you that the diversity of information you would face on Facebook is higher than the diversity of information you have in your offline world. That even in the offline world, you have your filter bubbles already. So actually, that Facebook might be more diverse than the information you face in the physical world. So that might be the one slightly surprising conclusion But to the slightly more pessimistic ones, during the final panel when we discussed the reaction to this problem, I believe we all agreed that the reaction has been so far inadequate, and that was, we are talking about the reaction from the governments, but also from the media, from the civil society, from the private business, the platforms. All of these segments of society underestimated the problem, and we are still not serious enough about it. There are still not enough resources put into this. This balance of resources is precisely the reason why an information aggressor like Russia can succeed in the information space. Their message is not more attractive. Their message is not more sophisticated. They just have the numbers. That's it. That's the only difference. Finally, during the panel where we discussed Russian and Chinese information operations, David Plášek, an expert from European Values who's focusing on China, he was highlighting that China will probably be a significantly bigger problem in the information space in the next decade. They have the resources that, for example, Russians do not have. It is true that their information operations had been clumsy, a bit more visible, a bit too obvious. The Russians, in comparison, they have a much better know-how, much better experience, the decades of disinformation operations during the Cold War. But we see that there are exchange programs between the Russian and Chinese state media, that the Chinese are learning from the Russians. You would even find researchers who are talking about so-called Russification of Chinese information operations. And this merge of Russian know-how, Russian experience, and Chinese resources, this might be extremely dangerous in the next few years. And if we don't get serious quickly enough, we will be facing a very big problem in the information space.
Thank you. Well, let me try and summarize. That was fascinating. Today, for those that weren't here, so we were looking at the world after Ukraine. We had two former Czech foreign ministers speaking here. We had the European editor of, the European correspondent for The Economist, and some others as well discussing these issues. We looked at you know, not Ukraine itself, but the ripple, the impact this is having and will have on the rest of the world, because the world, it's fractured a mirror, and we were trying to look at all the cracks that have been created by it. And some really interesting conversations. The first thing that came across strongly today, I think, particularly, well, actually, not just from the former foreign ministers, who you guys will know, but also from some of the journalists, was this is absolutely a civilizational conflict, it was put by one person. This is a fundamental conflict that we're all involved with. And that the strength of feeling about that this was something that was really one of those moments in history where the world goes one way or the other as a result of this, was very, very striking. So we looked, for example, at the implications, you know, for China, for China's role in the world, which could be very positive. For example, if the West gets distracted in Ukraine, China is trying to do a lot of things in the world that would love the West to be highly distracted. I think it was Jakub Zanto, who's many of you will know, is a Czech TV correspondent, said, you know, there's an old Czech saying, apparently, if two people are having a fight, the third person is laughing. And China is the third person in this discussion. The second thing that came across very strongly, which was really interesting to me, and again, one of the, Lubomir Zaorálek, one of the former foreign ministers, said this. He said, we've got to realize that around the world, we live in a European bubble where we all think it's pretty obvious who the good guys are and the bad guys in this situation. We all feel it's pretty clear. It doesn't look that way to large parts of the world. Martin, from talking about Africa, said, a lot of African nations are abstaining on votes on this or supporting Russians because they have huge Russian influence in their countries. Large parts of Asia don't see the conflict as being we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, or the Ukrainians are the good guys and the Russians are the bad guys. So they buy the story that this was an example of the Americans once again being colonial, pushing too far, pushing Russia too far, and Russia has had to respond just as they feel. So it's a very anti-Western view. And in fact, there was a strong consensus that really surprised me on the last panel we had, which said that the West is and will be weaker, much weaker as a result of what happens in Ukraine. Whatever the outcome, the West will be weaker around the world because of Ukraine for all sorts of reasons that we discussed over many hours today. And the final thought that, again, really struck me as someone who isn't Czech, coming from my side of Europe, where we feel we're really involved in this. We feel Britain feels, I think, that we've done quite a lot. We're doing, we're being good guys. But the strong sense that when you're living somewhere like the Czech Republic, that you really, really understand what's going on with Russia. That the Czechs and actually the Poles and some of the Baltic states have been taking a lead on this issue much more than other parts of Europe because it's obviously, for obvious reasons, for geography. It feels so close to you, it is close to you, and actually there's a kind of immediate recognition of what Russia's doing in a way that in other parts of Europe, Italy, maybe France, which has been a bit slow, Germany certainly, where there's a kind of reluctance to really get too involved, we'll do our bit, but there's a real strong sense that your country, amongst others, has really taken a lead in the response to the conflict and has to continue to do so because, as one person said today, he said this is actually a conflict about small countries against big countries, and the question is, can big countries once again just take what they want? And Czech, being a small country, really needs the European Union to be strong at this time. And there was a big discussion about whether the European Union is strong, but there was a strong sense that it should be playing a stronger role than ever before. So it was a very, very interesting conversation today on some of those issues. So before we have a discussion, I'm very keen, if any of the things you've heard so far raises a thought or a question for any of you, does anyone want to put their hands up and respond to anything? Yeah, please, the lady here. Do you want to get a microphone here? Thank you. And I do favour women, as I say today, but men can speak too, it's okay.
Okay, so I think it's really interesting how the event was put together conceptually, in the sense that we had a different topic sort of every day that we were looking at as the driving forces for change that we see in the world today. And I think it's really interesting how you summarized all the points. And I'm going to ask a question that I actually wanted to ask you during the previous panel, but we ran out of time, so I'm going to hijack this a little bit. But I think listening to you, even speaking now, all of you sort of kept coming back to Ukraine, even in the respective topics that you were talking about. So whether it was about climate change, obviously we see the connection to the sort of food crisis that we have connected with the Ukrainian situation, and also the energy crisis. When we talk about technology and digital tools that Russia has been using in the war, I think the connection is clear there as well. So what I wanted to ask you is, do you believe that the situation in Ukraine and the war is a driving force for change in its own right, or is it merely exposing certain trends that would have taken their course anyway? So is it truly something that is altering the course of history in a significant way, or is it simply sort of shining light on certain trends that we've been seeing in the other areas that we were talking about?
Thank you. I know you asked it to me, but I'm going to put that to everyone. So I appreciate that. Any other questions or thoughts before we respond to that? Okay, let's take that. Let's try and, I mean, it's a great question. Thank you very much, because it does try and bring things together. What do you guys think about that in terms of, if you put into the mix Ukraine, the technology that's being deployed in war there right now, okay? We heard today about the Chinese technology in Africa and so on. Is Ukraine just shining a light on all the things that are already happening in the world, or has it changed the world in some way? What do you think, Libor?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. I think it is a drive to change. And if we talk about the technology, and I was responsible for the technology sessions, we are more and more thinking about our safety and about protection of our technologies, because you maybe don't not realize, but the West has thousands of satellites in the cosmic space, and without these satellites, our information flow would get stuck, and we would not be able to work anymore. So now if we see Russia developing new laser systems, let's say, threatening our system in the cosmic space. This is one of the big changes that Europe is focusing now on safety and on protecting the satellites, not only technically, meaning to protect the mechanical systems, but to protect them against the misinformation or disinformation. That means to make it safe that nobody is, let's say, hacking our satellites and not distributing the mis or disinformation to the audience in Europe. So this is one of very significant change now these days, or these last 2-3 months, which was not visible 6 months ago, to protect our data and big data, which is created in Europe and in the United States, in order to protect them against the Russian hackers and all these, let's say,
that's
actions.
really interesting. So this has sparked action in an area. We knew there was a problem, but now we're really going to do something. Mark, in the link, one argument is that this is taking everyone's eyes away from the biggest issue in the world, which is climate change. What's your view of this?
So I think there were two terms in time. Firstly, the short-term effects, and then the long-term effects. So the short-term effects are different around the world. So the first thing is what's happened in Europe. Europe has suddenly woken up to the fact that they're beholden to Russian gas. And this has suddenly shocked them, even though experts like myself have been shouting at governments about energy security for the last 10 years. Now, admittedly, we were using it as an excuse to try and actually get them to do more renewables. So in Europe, they've suddenly woken up to the fact and gone, right, we need to actually put a lot more renewable energy in, because then we have energy security. And so they've doubled the amount of energy, renewable energy that will be built in the next 7 years. Tick. Fantastic. Yeah, then we go to the United States. The United States goes, ooh, energy. Well, guess what? We need to produce enough fossil fuels to make sure we're good, and actually this is an opportunity to export more. So the Biden administration, which when they came into power actually cut the actual legislation for the Arctic and the Alaskan oil pipelines, have now signed them. And so therefore what they've done is they've cranked up production of fossil fuels because A, they don't want to be beholden to other countries. And we're seeing that different mix around the world. In the long term, I think what's really important is this is a huge shock to the system, because it basically makes every government go, oh, one, I need to have my energy secure. Now, we thought that the Russians, the Saudis, and everybody else were nice people. Maybe not. Perhaps I need to actually build an energy system for our country that isn't beholden on other people's fossil fuels. Tick. So that's the long term. The other issue, you raised this, a brilliant point, which is about food security. So at the moment, we're having a food crisis, particularly in Africa, because they're so reliant on the cheap grain coming from Russia and from Ukraine. We saw this, interestingly enough, food price spikes in 2010 because of the Moscow heat wave, which then Russia then said we're not exporting any grain. But it's not actually a lack of food. So this is a really interesting thing. So we produce about enough food to feed 11 billion people. There's only 7.9 billion people on the planet. And so the interesting thing is it's the distribution of that food. It is the ability to be able to buy food. So people starve, not because of lack of food, because of lack of money. So that's another key thing we have to take into account. But also what happens is speculation. So food prices are going up, energy prices are going up, not necessarily because of the actual lack of them, but because in New York, in Tokyo, in London, they're all speculating on which way the food prices are going to go and driving up prices. And this is the thing that always upsets me, which is people are starving in Africa and in Southeast Asia because somebody's making a huge killing in London. Okay, so we have to be aware of that connectivity. I also want to pick up on, and I thought Stuart's point was really important, this war is incredibly important, because it goes back to the reason for the First World War, which is that small countries have to have sovereignty, they have to have protection, and therefore, if you allow them to be taken over, then suddenly the whole basis of the UN and the rule of law in the world suddenly starts to fall apart. And anybody or any country can be victim to this. So this is critical. As all these three speakers have said, it is a critical war that has to be won.
Thank you. Let's, same question. I mean, in terms of the subject you were looking at, disinformation, one thing that strikes me is that I wonder whether the same answer is, has it sparked action in an area where we all knew there was a problem? Or what do you think?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. I mean, I will begin a bit more broadly. Ukraine is the most important topic for disinformers, by far. Why is that? Because all the dividing lines are there. Freedom versus unfreedom. Democracy versus autocracy. And precisely, rule-based order versus rule of the might. That's Ukraine, ever since 2014. For me personally, 2014 and the Maidan Revolution, that was the turning point, and that's why I actually started working on the topic of Russian disinformation. Today, I'm wearing a T-shirt with the Ukrainian Trizub, trident, and on Thursday I had a T-shirt with the salute of the Snake Island warriors towards the Russian military warship, which I'm sure you remember. I have a good friend, Ukrainian philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko, and he sometimes says that he has a feeling that during this war, Ukraine is reminding Europe of what made Europe Europe, of what Europe is about, that it's about freedom, that it's about democracy, that it's about human rights and rule of law. And Ukrainians are now living these values. Their anthem has this beautiful verse that "Dušu i tělo my položím za našu svobodu." We will sacrifice our souls and our bodies for our freedom, and they are doing that. They are dying for their freedom. They are showing us that freedom is worth fighting for. So your question, is the situation in Ukraine a driving force for change? Well, it certainly should be. And I think for a few countries it has been. On the other hand, some of the countries that even you, Stuart, mentioned, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, in some countries we hear about this, Zeitenwende, but do we actually see the actions that would back it up? I'm slightly skeptical. So here I actually hope that it will be more the younger generation rather than the older generation that already made the mistakes that brought us here. It's kind of hard to admit that you made a mistake. You don't want to do that. So I think it will be more up to the young generation that will not repeat the mistakes that brought us to this phase.
Thank you. You were kind enough to ask me the question. By the way, the older generation were once the younger generation that made the same mistakes as the older people. You know that too. I'm going to pick up on everything these guys have said. I think inevitably it's not a simple answer, of course. But what I think happens when there's a big event in history like this is in some areas it accelerates history. So certain things happen that were going to happen over time. I mean, Mark's just given some examples of that where, at some point we were going to have to tackle some of these issues, but we're going to put them off, but suddenly we can't put them off anymore. The German gas pipeline thing is an amazing, we're warning. Oh, Christ, we can't do that. At some point something was going to trigger that, one guesses. And there are other areas we've just heard about where things that, we better tackle this disinformation now. We can't let it go on anymore. So I think it accelerates history in some areas, but it completely changes history in other areas as well, which I think is interesting. I started today telling the story of myself in 1989. I was a young TV reporter sent to Berlin 3 days after the Berlin Wall came down. That was an event that affected the world, of course, but particularly I was really aware, being in the Czech Republic, it changed all your lives, more than anyone perhaps else in the world. So if you're a young person not born in 1989, as I guess you were, your life is completely different because the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. You know that. So it feels to me like Ukraine is another one of those events. Arguably, there have been a few, 9/11, arguably, but for Europe, Ukraine feels to me like it's almost the end of that era that started in 1989. So now it's changed history in that sense. It's changed 2 new countries have joined NATO, maybe they wouldn't have done. It's changed history in the sense that countries that thought they could live with not spending much on defense, suddenly we're back in a needing to arm. Horrible thought. As I say, the big question for me is the climate change question, I have to say, because it's much bigger than any of these issues, of course. It dwarfs everything we're discussing, and yet it's not, it feels like it's gone down the agenda. And I'm really interested, you know, power politics is now becoming ever important again. 3 superpower politics, or maybe 2 really, because one of the things that came out today was the idea that Russia is becoming a client state of China. Russia is increasingly going to be a puppet of China because of its weakness, except for nuclear weapons. It's weak, so therefore it needs to now sell its gas to China over years. It needs Chinese technology to fuel its arms. China is going to be pulling the strings for Russia. They're really, apparently we heard before, 2 million Chinese people working in Siberia. They own a lot of Siberia. You know, it's amazing what's happening. So the great power politics is back big time. And that may mean that things like, well, let's put it to the panel. I mean, to some of these, so disinformation becomes a big issue. The battle for technology becomes a big issue. But does climate change become a secondary issue for in many of these situations? I'm really interested, Mark, to know your views on that.
So I think the problem is that climate change is always a secondary issue. And that's awful to say that. But when you are a politician and you're faced with re-election or revolution, depending on which country you're in, you have a lot of priorities. And those are feed your people, give them energy, give them jobs, etc. And therefore, climate change is at the bottom. It's also a wicked problem because it is long-term. For example, we can process the Ukraine war because it's happening now. We know what we have to do, and there are things that we can do immediately. Whereas climate change, yes, it's impacting. I mean, I'm going back to the UK, and they're going to have a 40-degree day. That's never happened. That's on Monday, okay? The highest we've ever had is 38 degrees, okay? So I know the Czechs have had 40 degrees, but, you know, we haven't. It's shocking. I'm going to die, you know.
We don't want it.
No, we don't. And so I think that's the biggest problem. The interesting thing, though, is if you look at the major players, 80% of the world's economy, okay, so that's all the big countries, have already pledged to go net zero this century. Now, most by 2050, India by 2070, and China by 2060. So we already have this huge political drive to go there. The economics is going. So if you happen to be a country and you want energy, renewables are cheaper than a coal-fired power station. Oh, and it's also now more secure. So it's interesting that even economics is driving that way. So even though it's not the primary, it's underlying there. I also pointed out, and it was interesting that the historian Chakrabarty picked up on this when I pointed out that the only reason that 195 countries ever really talk to each other is every autumn at the COP meetings. So the interesting thing is the environment and climate change brings all those disparate countries together in one place to talk all the time. They don't. You have the G7, you have the G77, they don't, but it's the only place they do. So it's interesting that this is a linking theme which also underlines security, because a lot of countries understand that climate change is a threat multiplier and is actually going to make their security worse. So unfortunately, no, it is not the primary, but actually underlines absolutely everything, and politicians are aware of that, particularly in China, the US, and Europe.
Thank you. Right, again, I invite anyone here who wants to make a comment on anything you've heard, any question you want to ask. Anyone want to? I'm looking around. There's a guy at the back there. Yeah.
I'll try to make it simple. Lots of my friends think that future will be worse than the present. That civilization already peaked. It's influenced by the war, by the climate change. Do you agree or disagree, hopefully, and why?
Brilliant question. Can I ask you, you're a young guy, What do you think? Well, just before we come to the panel, what's your view of that?
I'm optimistic, but many of my friends aren't, and I don't know how to explain them.
Right, we're going to give you the weapons right now.
Exactly.
Okay. Jacob, can we start with you? What's your view of that? You answer that question. Great question.
I'm afraid I won't be very optimistic, I'm sorry. But that was precisely the conclusion of our final panel when we talk about the reactions. On the current trajectory, if nothing changes, the problems will still be getting worse rather than better. The current trajectory is really going south. It's a problem of the resources. The disinformers are still achieving significantly better results than we would like them to. And that doesn't mean that you would have like a majority of the population believing disinformation. The last opinion poll that comes to mind, 30% of Slovakia believes that it's the West to blame for the war in Ukraine, which is obviously a nonsense, it's a Russian lie. Still, you have 1/3 of the population believing that. The trouble is that when it comes to, for example, close election or referendum results, like US elections in 2016 or the Brexit referendum you know so well, you are not really trying to influence 50+1% of the population. You are really targeting a small percentage. And if you can influence already that small percentage, you can decide the election result. That's a bit troubling. Currently, it looks like the disinformers are still getting better information about how our audiences receive and react to their information. Whereas we are not exactly increasing the resources in the same way. When I started in Brussels in 2015, our team for countering disinformation was like 7 people, I think. Currently it might be like 12. Can you imagine how many people are working on this in the Kremlin only? It will be 20 of them, and then it will be the whole government, all the embassies in the world, the army, the secret services. Only then come the media, which is again thousands of people, both in Russia and abroad. And then come the trolls on social media, another thousands of people. Our reaction is still miniature. So unfortunately, if nothing changes, the problem of disinformation will be getting worse.
That's fascinating. Let me ask you, Libor, your view. Just on that, unfortunately, to add to the depression, don't want to, but one of the guys spoke today. Again, Lubomir Zaoralek, a former foreign minister here, his view was that the quality of Western politicians that he sees, he's obviously sat in the room with many of the, he said even when he was foreign minister, he saw it going downhill. When he started, he felt there were really substantial people in the room. And then by the end, he felt that on the West, we had, whereas of course in Russia, it's been the same foreign minister for 20 years. In China, it's been the same guy. So the West is kind of a bit all over the place. Anyway, we'll come to the positive stuff soon. Here's the positive stuff. Come on, Libor, give us the positive stuff. Technology.
Well, I'm also optimistic, especially in medium and long term. I'm very optimistic about the future. I do believe that the issues will be more or less resolved, and the communities also, thanks to younger politicians in the future in many countries, might change in a positive way. In short term, I can follow my colleague that we can see, and we will see, some worsening of the climate, for example. I can say 2 examples, which one of them we have discussed on Wednesday. We are now, let's say, launching the Green Deal in the European Union, and we are investing in new technologies towards energy, the sustainable energy and circular economy. But at the same moment, China is building more than 100 coal power plants, and their impact on the climate change is much bigger than the impact of European Union. The whole European Union has less than 7% of the CO2 in the world, but the developed countries, they simply are continuing the policy of fossil energy resources. That means thanks to technologies, I do believe that we will be able to help this part of the world to develop in the right direction, and they will realize it. And now I will give my personal observation, because I was, until 2020, every year in summer visiting Russia and in Siberia, and you can see every summer, you can see the worsening situation, and it is a time bomb also in Russia, this climate change, because this permanently frozen soil permafrost is defreezing. And I could see that with my eyes, that their houses are falling down. I could see with my eyes the leak of this CNG, this natural gas, which is very dangerous in enormous big areas in Russia, in northern Russia. I personally was 300 kilometers north from the polar circle in summer. There was 35 degrees Celsius, and I could swim in the rivers, which are normally frozen at that period of. And I think the Russians have to deal with that, whatever they want to do. And it's independent on the war on Ukraine. Unfortunately now, the war in Ukraine is changing the priorities, but I do believe they will have to deal with that. And also the other countries, they will have to deal with that. Otherwise, they will be the first victims of this climate change.
Yeah, I mean, just on technology, just before we move on from technology, I want to come to that whole issue with you, Mark. There's a young guy. The other big thing on technology that everyone says is the machines are going to take all the jobs, right? There'll be no work for his generation because pretty much anything he can do, a machine in 10 years' time, AI, machine learning, robots, can do better. I'm sure you're a very talented guy, but that's what his friends say. Yep. What do you say to that?
Well, if you look in practice, and I have also my own personal experiences, the most advanced companies and also the most advanced countries, they even import the labor because we are lacking the labor. It's the same for the Czech Republic. We are technologically developing. I am not going to talk today about this minimum income issues that the technologies can help the global community to have the basic income, and we can simply feed the community in the world because of new technologies. But generally, it's not that we will be having redundant people, but we will be lacking people. The issue is that we need different competencies. We need that people need to requalify and learn new things for the new technological world. Even here in Ostrava, there are companies which in the past had hundreds of workers working in, for example, foundry. Now we have new modern technology. There is not so many workers, but the number of employees is higher than it was before. So we just employ different type of personnel.
But good news is the population of Africa is doubling in the next 30 years. There'll be a lot of people around. Mark?
So I'm also an optimist. And I think the reason being is because each generation thinks slightly differently about the world. So, for example, it's a great shame that the Brexit vote wasn't today because enough old people have died that actually we wouldn't have left the EU, okay? It's ridiculous, okay? So it has been a generational push to leave because of ideas of the past and nostalgia, which were not real. And so what's interesting is that we have seen this power of the new generation. So if you see the climate strikes that occur around the world, before the pandemic, we peaked at about 5 million young people going onto the streets going, I'm sorry, you lot have mucked it up. Could you please try to do something with it before we come into power? So I also think that we really have to work on something, which is we deserve good leaders. We deserve proper, inspirational leaders. We need good governance. And so what we need is a new generation of politicians that come through who are actually able to articulate the requirements of the people. I was incredibly lucky to interview the ex-Prime Minister of Bhutan, and he basically stated very clearly that politicians should be seen as servants to the people, not power mongers. And I think that's something we need to change the actual ideas about politics and what it's there for. And we have an opportunity. I mean, Europe has such a diversity of ideas and communities. We need that politics. And it's really interesting that there are some incredible things that happen in the EU that spread out across the rest of the world, that influence. And I think we should actually build on that instead of criticizing ourselves internally, And I'm really sorry, my country has left, okay? I mean, Stuart and I are going to work hard to try and pull us back at some point, but, you know, you might not want us back. But I think I'm really optimistic because the next generation thinks differently about the world. They have been through the pandemic. They know how vulnerable they are to nature, to the climate, and of course, we're seeing all the extreme climate events around the world from last year. Last year, I have to say, as a climate scientist, we all sat and basically just counted them off and went, this is ridiculous. We weren't expecting that number of climate extreme events for another 10, 15 years. So I think the warning signs are there and everybody's hearing them, so I'm optimistic about change is going to happen.
Your question actually reminded me of a conversation I had the other day with an old lady. So I may seem old to you already. She seemed old to me. She was sitting there saying, oh, it's not like it used to be. It was much better when I was young. It was fantastic. You know, the world, it's all so horrible now, these young people with their machines. It's terrible. I said, well, hold on, let me remember. Did you have much food when you were younger? You know, well, no, we were starving. We had no food, but it was much. But didn't you go through a war? Oh, yeah, we did have a war. That wasn't very nice. But it was still much better in those days. And, you know, so, of course, I said, well, could it just be that it was better because you were a young woman then? And now you're an old woman. It doesn't feel quite so good, right? And I think there's something in that. Unfortunately, though, since I'm also on this panel, though I'm asking the questions, I have to say, I'm by nature an optimist, a very positive person. But wherever I look right now, I do see challenges. I'm actually someone that is really scared of technology right now. I have to say, I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-technology, but I've attended so many discussions and read about pretty much every way in which technology will start hollowing out the economy in terms of jobs, in terms of the functions that people earn a living by, reducing some of the. So I think this is a complete different leap we're making compared to any technology change that's happened before. Because everyone says, well, other jobs emerge, as you just did. I just wonder just how true that will be, but I hope I'm wrong. I think we're entering a new era now. As I said, I think our generation's been very lucky in the last 30, 40 years, or post-Berlin Wall coming down, of a relatively stable, I mean, obviously there's always bad stuff happening, but the world generally getting better for millions and hundreds of millions of people around the world in terms of food. Right now, I read in The Economist recently, there are more obese people in the world than starving people. That man's nodding, he saw the same statistic. There are more people overweight than starving in the world, and many of them are not in Europe and America. I mean, many of them are in America, but many of them are not there. They're in other countries that have just adopted crap food and, you know, watching them, looking at the machine all day and playing video games and stuff. So, but of course there's some great stuff too. That's it. That's my positive note. Okay, any other questions? Oh, there's lady here, fantastic.
Sorry. It's not a question, it's just a comment from practice. I have heard so many beautiful words, and I worked at a municipal house, but I want to tell my experience from work. I worked at a municipal house, and I worked, you know, if you want to build a new house in some place, you need some approval from the office. I don't know if I explain it. So I was just the one who put this approval. And what I learned is that nature is for free. It's always better for everyone to make money to come and build a new house in a place where was a green land. Nature is for free, and that's its biggest weakness. I think what we must change is that, I don't know how to say in English, but somehow monetize the nature as such. Because it's so cheap to keep Greenland. It's so better for everyone to make money, just put a concrete and new house and so on.
Yeah, I think your point is, I think we understand your point very well. It's a really powerful point. Before I throw it to these guys, I was really struck many years ago. Prince Charles, who many of you know is one of our royals, but he's actually been ahead of so many things. He suggested many years ago, you may know this, that the rainforests of the world be declared international trust, like we have the National Trust in the UK, and all the countries will need to put a lot of money in, obviously, for those countries to support that, but they should be declared, that, in other words, there should be money and value attached to it, and there's a cost, there's a much higher cost to do with it than to cut the trees down than how cheap it is to cut trees down in the Amazon rain or whatever. And I think that's good. That point there, that nature is free and that's the problem, whereas everything else costs money. What do you guys want to say on that? Yeah, Mark.
So you make an incredibly important point. The biggest problem that we've had for the last 30 years is neoliberalism. The idea that the markets know best, that capital, that money is what drives everything. And it's really interesting that there is a backlash to that, and that's actually happening. And there are some really incredible economists that you should read who are coming into the forefront. Kate Raworth, who talks about the donut economics, who literally shows that the 8 fundamentals of classical economics are wrong. You've got Mariana Mazzucato, who's talking about the power of the state as an entrepreneur. So the interesting thing is most entrepreneurial stuff that happens in countries, particularly Western countries, is ultimately driven by the state through funding, subsidies, or just a way that they've actually provided incentives for companies. So I think there is a real move away from that whole neoliberalism. You mentioned, and I'm so glad you did, universal basic income and the idea that sort of actually we can free up people. What's really interesting is this whole new capitalism, neoliberalism. Actually, if you go back, I was amazed to find from my American colleagues that a very similar system to universal basic income was suggested by Richard Nixon, a Republican, in 1973 for America, because he felt that all people in America should have some basic money so they could actually buy into the economy and be secure. And what was really interesting, it was voted down by the Democrats because it didn't go further enough. Can you imagine if America had that basic income in the 1970s and carried it through? So again, I think these ideas coming back because, again, we need different ways of thinking. We need different economics. We need different ways of valuing nature. We need different ways of valuing each other and our time. We are not just people that work, okay? We are people that create art, music, look after our elderly relatives. All those things need to be valued within a society, not just cash.
Can I come to you on this a little bit? Because not just on nature, one of the things that some people have talked about, you obviously answer that question if you want to, but from the technology, one of the suggestions people have made is that actually robots should be taxed as if they're humans. So if you've read that, I think Bill Gates suggested this, that you should, if we're going to lose jobs, in other words, the bigger question is how do we attach value to different things? How, do the way we attach value to different things have to change?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the question, and you are fully right. If we look at the number of green fields which are disappearing in our country every year, and being replaced not only by the private houses, but also by the big logistics centers, or by supermarkets, or by generally concrete, as we say in Czech, beton. We are becoming a beton country, and I think that's wrong. But every city has the right to simply make the maps and make let's say, the plans where you want to have these houses, or you want to have there a park or a forest. It's really above. It's really about the municipal power, and we should simply, as everybody here probably, vote for the people who care, and not to vote for the people who don't care or who consider this city map as a source of income, let's say illegal income, because we know also many examples that they were changing the maps in order to make money on the property. So you are right. The nature is too cheap, and something has to change. And I think in 2 or 3 months we have elections, so let's vote.
Look, I asked you about that, but I'm going to interrupt you only because we've got only a few minutes left. Now, I'm keen to take one more question. There's a lady here. I'm sorry, so I'm favouring ladies today. So there's a lady just right there, not unconnected to one of our speakers. Just quickly now, because we've got a couple of minutes left. So quick question, quick answers.
Okay, so I'm hoping that this is because there's been a lot of discussions about carbon emission in terms of like what China is going to be like in the future and European Union. And I think one of the important things, also having all the young audience here, I think it's important to mention this. I don't know if this is going to be appropriate for this one, but it's the historic emission. We talk about how EU is emitting a lot less than China, but we should never forget about the $10 billion that the promise that rich countries are supposed to be giving to the poor countries in order to be able to solve the climate crisis and basically use that money to be able to invest in renewable energy and green energy. So I think it's one of the very important topics that we don't seem to be talking a lot about it. And I thought just talking about China, EU, and America, I think it's one of the important points that we need to make in order to be able to.
Just because of time, we're not going to get into it now. Because I didn't come to Jacob, you don't have to respond to that. Any final thoughts from you, Jacob, before we wrap up from the things we've discussed today? You don't have any? No? Well, that's perfect, because we've only got a few seconds left. Right, quick concluding comments from me. First of all, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. It's been an amazing 4 days for us. What's really struck all of us, I think, certainly struck me, is how great it is to see young, engaged people here really interested in these subjects with points of view and strong views. I mean, it's really fantastic. I really congratulate you on choosing to come to discussions like this at such an incredible event. Thank you all for doing, thank to my panelists, but I'm going to ask you all to do us a favour. You know how all the bands at the end of their event, they all get the crowd to cheer and then they do a selfie? You know how they do that? You've been seeing the bands do that? We're going to do the same thing. So we're going to do a selfie of the four of us, and we want you all to clap while we're doing our selfie. Will you do that for me? Thank you. Come on, let's stand up, guys. Let's do our selfie. This is so artificial. So what? We're bands. All right, off you go.